Lily Carter pressed her face against her father's arm and stopped breathing. The laughter hit her like a slap sharp open and completely unashamed. Three women standing near the bolts of fabric didn't lower their voices. They didn't even try. They looked directly at her worn dress, at her patched hem, at her father's cracked boots, and they laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd seen all season. Lily was 8 years old, and she already knew what it felt like to be invisible in a room full of people who were looking straight at you. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart, do me a favor right now. Hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story on this channel. Drop a comment down below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Redwood Valley, Wyoming, 1882, and stay with Thomas and Lily Carter all the way to the end. Because I promise you what happens in that store is only the beginning. Thomas Carter had been awake since before the sun. That wasn't unusual. He'd been rising before dawn for the better part of 15 years, ever since he'd staked his claim on 40 acres of Wyoming grassland and decided he was going to make something of it or die honest trying. Most mornings, he fed the horses first, checked the fence line along the eastern pasture, boiled coffee so thick you could stand a spoon in it, and had half a day's work behind him before Lily even opened her eyes. He liked those quiet hours before the world woke up. Liked the sound of the land settling, the cattle moving slow through the gray morning light, the way the frost came off the grass when the sun finally cleared the ridge. In those hours, it was easy to believe that a man could be exactly what he chose to be, no more, no less. But this morning, Thomas had something different on his mind. He stood at the small wooden table near the window and looked down at the dress Lily had worn to school 3 times already this week. It was the one she'd had since spring. A light blue calico he'd cut and stitched himself from a bolt of fabric he'd traded 2 days of labor for. He wasn't a tailor by any stretch. The seams weren't perfect. The hem was slightly uneven on the left side. But he'd been proud of it when he finished, and Lily had hugged him so hard when she first put it on that he had to clear his throat twice before he trusted his voice again. Now it was October. The Wyoming wind had turned mean, and that blue calico wasn't going to carry her through winter. "Papa." He heard her before he saw her small feet on the wooden floor. The particular way she walked, that was all her mother's light and quick and certain. "Mornin', sweetheart." Lily appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, wearing the blue dress, her dark hair not yet braided, her eyes still soft from sleep. She looked at the dress he was holding and tilted her head the way she did when she was working something out. "Are we going to town today?" "We are," Thomas said. "Need to get you some winter fabric. Can't have you freezing halfway through November." Lily considered this seriously. "Mrs. Harmon says the cold comes early this year. She said the squirrels were storing nuts since August." "Mrs. Harmon's usually right about squirrels." Thomas set the dress down and turned to the stove. "Eat something first. We'll head in after the morning chores." What Thomas did not tell her, what he would not tell her, was how long he'd been saving for this. 43 cents at a time some weeks. $1 when the cattle sold better than expected. He kept the money in a tin behind the loose board under the kitchen window, the same place he'd kept every small savings since Martha died. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a decent bolt of wool fabric, maybe a little extra for thread, and 2 new buttons if Whitaker's wasn't running their prices up again. I didn't think about the money the way some men did, as a measure of worth, a ledger of failure and success. Money was a tool. You used what you had, you saved what you could, and you tried not to let the gap between what you had and what you needed become the whole story of your life. He'd learned that from his father. He hoped he was teaching it to Lily. The morning chores took 2 hours. Thomas repaired a section of fencing near the north paddock where one of the older posts had finally given up. Lily fed the chickens and collected eggs and talked to the mare, whose name was Rosie, and who had strong opinions about people who didn't scratch her properly behind the ears. By the time they hitched the wagon and pointed it toward town, the sun was up and the sky had gone that pale, sharp blue that only came in Wyoming autumn. Lily sat beside him on the wagon bench with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes moving across the countryside the way they always did, taking everything in, filing it away, saving it for later. She was a quiet child, but not a sad one. There was a difference, Thomas knew, even if other people sometimes confused the two. "Papa," she said about a mile from town. Will they have the red wool, the kind I saw last spring?" "I don't know, honey. We'll look. I just thought it would be nice." She paused. "It doesn't have to be red." Thomas reached over and tugged her braid lightly. "We'll find something good." Redwood Valley sat at the edge of a wide valley where two creeks met, which was why people had settled there in the first place. By 1882, it had grown into a proper town, a main street with a post office and a bank and a doctor's office and 3 churches, and at the far end, Whitaker's General Store, which was the largest and most respected commercial establishment in the county. Jerome Whitaker had built the store himself 20 years earlier, and ran it with his wife Edna, who kept the books and knew the price of everything down to the last halfpenny. The store carried everything from flour and salt to ready-made clothing, fabric tools, harnesses, patent medicines, and imported goods that arrived twice a month by freight wagon from Cheyenne. It was the kind of place where the right people were greeted warmly and the wrong people were made to feel it without a word being said. Thomas knew which category he fell into. He knew it the moment he tied up the wagon and helped Lily down onto the boardwalk. He knew it from the way the 2 men standing near the door glanced at his boots and then looked away. He knew it from the way Jerome Whitaker nodded at him from behind the counter, not unfriendly exactly, but careful. The kind of nod that said, "I see you and I'll serve you and please don't take too long." But Thomas had been coming to this store for 15 years, and he had always paid what he owed, and he had never given anyone a reason to treat him poorly. So he held the door open for his daughter, touched the brim of his hat to the 2 men outside, and walked in. The store smelled like dried herbs and linseed oil, and the faint sweetness of hard candy kept in a jar near the counter. Lily inhaled it with quiet pleasure. She liked coming to town even when it made Thomas nervous. She noticed he missed the color of the light through the windows, the way the bolts of fabric were arranged by weight rather than color. The small mechanical bank shaped like a bird that sat on the edge of Jerome's counter and that she had been fascinated by since she was 4. Thomas steered them toward the back wall where the fabric bolts were kept. He was looking at the wool, good heavy stuff in gray and dark blue and a serviceable brown when he became aware that the room had changed. Not loudly, not with any single clear signal. It was more like a temperature shift, something that happened slowly until suddenly you felt it all at once. There were 4 women shopping near the dry goods section. Women Thomas recognized from town: Eleanor Hartwell, whose husband ran the bank; her sister-in-law Margaret, who organized the Methodist Women's Circle; a woman named Dorothea Crane, whose family owned the largest hotel in the valley; and a younger woman Thomas didn't know well, fashionably dressed, who was visiting from somewhere else. They were looking at Lily, not the way people looked at children, with the mild warmth of adults encountering small people they had no particular feeling about. They were looking at Lily the way people look at something out of place, something that doesn't belong in the picture. Eleanor leaned toward Margaret and said something Thomas couldn't hear. Margaret covered her mouth with 2 fingers and made a sound that was almost a laugh. Lily had noticed. Of course she had. She had her mother's eyes wide and clear and quick to catch meaning in the way people held themselves, the way they arranged their faces. She reached over and tucked her fingers into Thomas's hand. He felt it like a current. "Papa," she said very quietly, "those ladies are looking at my dress." Before Thomas could respond, Eleanor Hartwell spoke up. Not to him. Not even directly at Lily. She spoke to the room in the tone women like her used when they wanted to say something cutting without the inconvenience of being called on it. "It's a shame, isn't it?" Eleanor said pleasantly, "when a child is brought into town looking like that, in October no less." Dorothea Crane made a soft sound of agreement. "Some people simply don't have the sense to know what's appropriate." The younger woman laughed. "Not mean, worse than mean. Careless." Like Lily was something amusing that had wandered through the door. Margaret Hartwell shook her head with an expression of theatrical sympathy. "Poor little thing. Maybe someone ought to check the charity box. I believe there was a donation from the Calloways last month. Something in a smaller size, perhaps." And that was the one that landed. Thomas felt his jaw go tight. He felt the heat that moved up from his chest and into his face, that old, familiar heat. He'd been managing his entire life, the one that told him to say something, to move, to respond to, make them understand what they'd just done. He set the wool bolt down carefully, because if he didn't do something careful with his hands right, then he wasn't sure what he'd do with them. Lily had gone completely still. That was what hurt the most. Not the anger, the stillness. The way she stopped moving, stopped breathing, almost like an animal that has learned that stillness is safer than reaction. Like she'd learned this before. Like she was prepared for it in a way no 8-year-old child should have to be prepared for anything. Thomas crouched down to her level right there in the middle of Whitaker's general store and put both his hands on her shoulders. "Look at me," he said quietly. Lily looked at him. Her eyes were bright. She wasn't going to cry. She was too proud for that, too much her mother's daughter, but it was close. "Those women don't know anything about you," Thomas said. "Not one single thing. You understand me?" Lily nodded. "Once. Small and tight. And they don't know anything about this dress either." He looked down at it for a moment. "You know who made this dress?" She almost smiled. "You did." "That's right. And I made it bad. You made it a little crooked on one side." "I sure did." He squeezed her shoulders gently. "But I made it with everything I had, and that's worth more than anything those women bought with their husbands' money. You remember that?" Lily leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his for just a moment. One of those gestures that was all hers. Something she'd done since she was a toddler. This quiet way of connecting that didn't need words. Then she straightened up and turned back toward the fabric bolts like nothing had happened. Thomas stood, squared his shoulders, and went back to looking at the wool. He chose the dark blue. It was good weight, honest material, and it reminded him of the color of the Wyoming sky just before a storm, something powerful and protective in it. He brought it to the counter and counted out his coins carefully while Jerome Whitaker watched without expression. The 4 women had gone back to their own shopping, their voices low and bright, as if nothing had occurred. Thomas took his package and turned toward the door. And then Lily stopped. She stood in the middle of the store and looked back at the 4 women. Her face was composed. Her hands were at her sides. She looked in that moment older than 8-something in the set of her jaw, the directness of her gaze. "Papa," she said. "Yeah, sweetheart. Why do some people think money makes them better than other people?" The store went quiet. Not the polite, shifting quiet of people pretending not to listen. Real quiet. The kind that meant everyone in the room had heard and was holding still, waiting. Thomas looked at his daughter standing there in her old blue calico dress, with her dark eyes clear and her chin up and her question hanging in the air like something that couldn't be taken back. He thought about the answer a long time, not because he didn't have one, because he wanted to give her the right one. "They don't, Lily," he finally said. "They only think they do. There's a difference." Eleanor Hartwell made a small dismissive sound. Dorothea Crane looked at the floor. The younger woman had gone very still. Thomas held the door for his daughter. And as Lily walked through it, she did not look back. That composure, that quiet, deliberate composure in an 8-year-old child who had every right to be crumbling, was the thing that stayed with Thomas all the way back to the wagon. He helped her up to the bench, climbed up beside her, gathered the reins. His hands weren't entirely steady. He didn't let her see that. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm all right," Lily said. She looked out at the main street of Redwood Valley with that careful, considering expression. "Papa, do you think we'll ever have enough money that people stop looking at us like that?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Maybe," he said honestly. "But I'll tell you something, Lily. The people I've respected most in this life, I never thought about what they were wearing. Not once. You want to know what I remember about them?" Lily looked at him. "What they did when things got hard," Thomas said. "Who they were when it cost them something to be decent. That's what stays." Lily considered this the way she considered everything seriously, thoroughly, turning it over like a stone to see what lived underneath. "I think the woman with the green hat is unhappy," she said finally. Thomas blinked. "Eleanor Hartwell, She looked at me the way people look when they're trying not to feel bad about themselves. Lily folded her hands in her lap. I think she's not a good person on the inside. I think she knows it. Thomas stared at his daughter for a long moment. Where on earth, he said, did you get that from? Lily shrugged. Mama used to say that cruelty was just pain with nowhere to go. He had to look away after that. Looked out at the road and the sky and the long grass moving in the October wind. Martha had said that. He remembered exactly when. Standing in this very road after a Sunday service where someone had spoken badly about a family the congregation didn't approve of. She'd said it to him like it was obvious, like she couldn't understand why it wasn't obvious to everyone. Pain with nowhere to go. He'd thought about that phrase 1,000 times in the 6 years since he lost her. Thought about it when the bank turned down his loan application with barely a glance at his papers. Thought about it when a cattle buyer drove past his property and stopped 3 miles up the road at Harrington's Spread instead. Thought about it on the nights when the ranch felt less like a home and more like a thing he was endlessly fighting to keep from swallowing him whole. I thought about it now, sitting in this wagon with his daughter in front of the store where 4 women had just used a child's dress to make themselves feel superior. Pain with nowhere to go. He supposed that was true, and he supposed it didn't make it any easier to be the place that pain landed. The drive home was mostly quiet. Lily fell asleep against his arm somewhere around the 2-mile marker, her head tilting onto his shoulder with the particular heaviness of a child who has held herself together long enough and finally let go. Thomas kept the horses steady and didn't move his arm. I was thinking about the winter, about the fence posts that needed replacing, about the cattle prices which had been dropping all month, about the roof of the barn which had a section near the west wall that he'd been watching get worse since July, about the tin behind the kitchen board, now mostly emptied out to pay for blue wool fabric. I was good at this particular kind of thinking, the steady problem-by-problem accounting that kept a man from despair. You didn't think about all of it at once. You thought about the next thing, and the next, and the next. He was deep in the arithmetic of winter when the horse slowed on its own. Thomas looked up. A wagon was coming from the opposite direction. A fine wagon, not showy exactly, but clearly maintained by someone with the means to maintain it properly. Good horses. Both of them matched roans. A young man driving. And in the back, a woman sitting straight and composed, looking at the valley with the expression of someone who was making a careful assessment of what she was seeing. Thomas pulled to the right to give them room on the road. The wagons passed close on the narrow track. The woman turned and looked at him directly, not with the appraising dismissal of someone measuring his worth, but with genuine attention, the look of a person who was actually curious about what they were seeing. She was around 35, maybe younger, with dark eyes and clothing that was practical rather than ornamental. She looked like someone who made decisions and meant them. Thomas touched the brim of his hat, an automatic gesture, half politeness, half habit. The woman nodded. A real nod. The kind that acknowledged something. Then the wagons passed each other, and Thomas was looking at the road ahead again, and the roans were moving away behind him, and in about 30 seconds, he'd forgotten it entirely because there was the fence to think about, and the roof to think about, and his daughter asleep against his shoulder, and everything that needed doing between now and spring. He did not know that woman's name. He did not know that she had spent the last hour riding slowly through the valley, looking at the land with the eyes of someone who intended to buy a very large piece of it. He did not know that she had earlier that morning already heard about Whitaker's General Store, about the cowboy who came in with his daughter, about what the Hartwell woman had said about the dress. She'd heard it from the livery stable boy who'd heard it from the delivery man who'd been making a drop at the store when it happened, and who had not. It was clear approved of what he'd witnessed. Thomas did not know any of this. He just drove home through the October afternoon, one hand on the reins and one arm keeping his sleeping daughter steady, thinking about fence posts and roof shingles and the particular mathematics of a life held together entirely by will and love and stubbornness and the refusal, even now, even after everything, to stop believing it was worth it. Back at the store, Jerome Whitaker was sweeping the floor after the afternoon customers had gone. He swept past the spot where the girl had stood in her blue calico dress. He swept past the spot where her father had crouched down and held her by the shoulders and said the things a father says when he can't fix the world, but he can make sure his child knows her own worth. He paused near the window broom in both hands. Through the glass, he could just see the road that led north out of town, the road Thomas Carter had taken home. Jerome Whitaker had run this store for 20 years. He had watched this town grow from 40 families to 400. He had extended credit when people needed it and called it in when he had to. He was not a cruel man. He would not have said that about himself. He would have said he was a practical man, a fair man, a man who understood the realities of commerce and society. But standing there with his broom watching the empty road, he felt something he hadn't expected. He felt ashamed, not of the women, their behavior wasn't his to own, but of himself. For saying nothing. For standing behind his counter and watching a child be humiliated in his store and going on weighing flour and making change, like it was all just the ordinary texture of an ordinary afternoon. He'd told himself it wasn't his business. He swept the floor again and didn't much like the man he met in the thinking. Outside, the sun was dropping behind the western ridge and the temperature was falling with it, and somewhere on the road north, Thomas Carter was almost home. Lily woke up just as the ranch came into view, that drowsy, disoriented return from sleep that always took her a moment to navigate. "Papa." "Right here, sweetheart." She sat up and rubbed her eyes and looked at the ranch, the house, the barn, the paddock where Rosie was already moving toward the gate because she could hear the wagon coming, and she approved of punctuality. "We're home," Lily said. "We're home," Thomas agreed. She was quiet for a moment looking at the house. Then she said, "Papa, I want to learn to sew properly, so I can help make the next dress." Thomas looked at her. "You want to learn to sew? You made my dress wrong," she said very matter-of-factly. "I should know how to do it right." He laughed, a real laugh, sudden and surprised, the kind that cleared out something tight that had been sitting in his chest all afternoon. "All right," he said. "I'll teach you what I know, which isn't much, and then we'll figure out the rest together." Lily nodded like this was a decision made and done. Thomas brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down and helped her to the ground. She immediately went to say hello to Rosie, which was what she always did, and he unloaded the wagon and checked the horses and began the slow, familiar work of closing up the day. And it was just that. A day. Hard in some ways, good in others, unremarkable in the larger scheme, except for a few minutes in a store and a question asked in a quiet voice by a girl in a calico dress. He did not know, could not know, that the woman in the fine wagon was at this very moment sitting across a table from the town land agent, making inquiries about a ranch property 6 miles south of his property that had been sitting empty for 2 years since the Ballard family picked up and moved west. He did not know her name. He did not know that she had made a decision today, not just about land, but about something else. Something she'd seen in the brief moment when the road narrowed and 2 wagons passed each other, and a man with tired eyes and a sleeping child on his arm tipped his hat with the simple dignity of someone who had not forgotten, despite everything the world had done to make him forget, that he was worth the gesture. She had noticed that. Clara Whitmore had always noticed things other people missed. It was, in her experience, the most important business skill she possessed. And tomorrow, she was going to walk into Whitaker's general store and see for herself what the land agent had already told her, what the livery boy had confirmed, and what her own eyes on that road had suggested. She was going to find out exactly what kind of man Thomas Carter was. She had a feeling she already knew. But Clara Whitmore did not make decisions based on feelings. She made them based on evidence. And Redwood Valley, Wyoming, in the autumn of 1882, was about to give her quite a bit of it. Clara Whitmore did not sleep well that night. That wasn't unusual for her. She'd never been a good sleeper, even as a child. Her mind kept moving long after her body had given up, turning problems over, examining them from different angles, looking for the thing she'd missed. Her father used to say she'd been born with an engine that didn't have an off switch. He'd meant it as a compliment. Most of the time. She lay in the narrow bed of the Redwood Valley boarding house and stared at the ceiling and thought about a man tipping his hat. That was the detail she kept coming back to. Not the land. Not the numbers the land agent had given her, which were favorable. Not the assessment she'd made of the valley itself, which suggested real potential if managed correctly. Not even what the livery boy had told her about what had happened in Whitaker's store. Just that moment on the road, the wagon coming from the opposite direction. The man who had looked tired, in the way that only comes from years of honest effort, not weakness. The child asleep against his arm. And the hat, the simple, unhurried lift of his hand to his brim, like he was greeting a neighbor, like it cost him nothing to be decent, even when the afternoon had clearly already cost him quite a bit. Clara had met a great many men in her life. Men who deferred to her because of her money. Men who resented her for the same reason. Men who spoke to her like she was a representative of her father's estate, rather than a person with her own mind. Men who smiled with their mouths and measured with their eyes and assumed she'd eventually tire of running a company and marry someone who would do it for her. She had not yet tired of it, but she had somewhere along the way grown very good at reading people quickly. It was a skill you developed when you spent enough years being underestimated. You learned to look past the surface, past the clothing and the manners and the way a person held themselves when they thought they were being watched, and find the thing underneath. The character. The actual content of a person. What she'd seen in Thomas Carter in that brief moment on that road was content. She got up before sunrise dressed without noise and went downstairs to wait for the day to begin. The boarding house owner, a wide, cheerful woman named Agnes Pruitt, appeared in the kitchen around 5:30 with the particular energy of someone who had been awake since 4. Early riser, Agnes observed, setting a coffee pot on the stove like it was a personal victory. Always have been, Clara said. Agnes looked at her with the frank curiosity of a woman who didn't see many unaccompanied female guests. You're the one buying the Ballard place. Thinking about it. Thinking. Agnes repeated the word like it tasted funny. Well, the Ballards thought about it for 2 years before they gave up. Sometimes thinking takes too long. Sometimes acting too fast costs more than thinking too long, Clara said. Agnes considered this. You sound like my second husband. Was he a smart man? Smartest fool I ever met. Agnes poured coffee into a heavy mug and set it in front of Clara without being asked. What's your business with the land? Cattle. I run a trading company. Inherited it from my father. Agnes sat down across from her with her own cup. She had the manner of a woman who had decided that since she was up anyway, she might as well have a conversation. A woman running a cattle company. She said it without mockery, more like she was confirming a detail she found interesting. And you want to set up an operation here? I want to expand one. I already have 2 properties in Montana and 1 in Nebraska. Clara wrapped both hands around the mug. The Wyoming Valley has better grass than either. That it does. Agnes looked at her for a moment. You know Thomas Carter. Clara looked up. The Cowboy, Agnes said. 40 acres north of town. You pass his road on the way to the Ballard property. I saw him on the road yesterday, Clara said carefully. Agnes nodded slowly. Good man. Hard worker. Lost his wife 6 years ago and kept that ranch going with pure stubbornness, far as I can tell. His little girl comes in sometimes with him. Lily. She paused. Heard there was some unpleasantness yesterday at Whitaker's. I heard the same. Agnes set her cup down. Eleanor Hartwell has been unpleasant since she was 9 years old. Didn't stop when her father bought the bank and won't stop now that her husband runs it. She looked at Clara steadily. You planning on spending time at Whitaker's today? I am. Agnes nodded, like something had been confirmed. Then let me tell you something about Redwood Valley, Miss Whitmore. This town respects 2 things, money and history. You've got the first. You don't have the second yet. She stood up and went back to the stove. Be careful how you spend what you've got. Clara finished her coffee and thought about that all the way to Whitaker's General Store. She arrived mid-morning when the store would be full enough to matter. She had dressed carefully, not elaborately, but well. Dark wool jacket, practical, but clearly quality. Good boots. Hair pinned simply. She looked like what she was, a woman with resources and no interest in pretending otherwise, but also no interest in performing wealth for anyone's benefit. She pushed open the door of Whitaker's and walked in. Jerome Whitaker looked up from behind the counter. His expression did the thing she'd seen 100 times: the rapid reassessment, the shift from professional neutrality to something slightly more attentive as he registered her clothing, her bearing, the deliberate way she moved through a room. "Good morning, ma'am," he said. "Help you with something?" "Possibly," Clara said. "I'm looking for a few things. I'll browse first if you don't mind." Jerome gestured expansively at the store. "Take your time." She moved to the fabric section first, not because she needed fabric, but because she wanted to stand where it had happened. She stood near the bolt of dark blue wool and looked at the room the way she imagined a child might look at it from a lower angle, from the position of someone who had come in wanting something simple and been made to feel wrong for wanting it. "That's a fine choice if you're looking at the wool." She turned. Eleanor Hartwell was standing 3 feet away, smiling with the particular warmth of someone who has identified a social peer and wants to establish contact. She was a handsome woman in her 40s, well-dressed, with the posture of someone who had been told to stand up straight so many times that it had become who she was. "Thank you," Clara said pleasantly. "Are you visiting Redwood Valley? I don't believe I've seen you before." Eleanor extended her hand. "Eleanor Hartwell. My husband is James Hartwell. He runs First Valley Bank." Clara shook her hand. "Clara Whitmore. I'm looking at property in the area." Eleanor's smile widened. "How wonderful. There are several fine properties available. William Harrington might be a good person to speak with. He knows the land here better than anyone. His family has been in the valley for 30 years. Is that right?" "The valley is quite exclusive, actually," Eleanor said with the casual pride of someone describing a membership. "We have very few newcomers. The community is particular about who fits in." Clara looked at her steadily. "Particular how?" Eleanor laughed a light, polished laugh. "Well, you know, standards. There are families here who have worked very hard to build something. They want neighbors who are the same kind of people." She glanced at Clara's jacket, the quality of it, and seemed to relax further. "I can see you'd have no trouble at all." Clara let the silence sit for exactly 1 beat too long. "I understand there was some trouble in this store yesterday," she said. Eleanor's smile didn't disappear, but it changed. "I'm sorry." "A man came in with his daughter, looking for winter fabric." Clara kept her voice completely even. "I've heard there were some unkind words said about the child's dress." The smile was gone now. Eleanor's face had arranged itself into something careful. "I'm not sure what you've heard, but I think what I've heard is accurate," Clara said. And then she did something very simple. She picked up the bolt of dark blue wool, the same one just like it, and carried it to the counter. Jerome Whitaker was already watching. He had been watching the whole time. Clara could see from behind the fortress of his counter, following the conversation with the focused attention of a man who understood that something important was happening in his store and was not yet sure which way it was going to land. Clara set the bolt on the counter. "I'd like 6 yards of this," she said. "And whatever the finest winter dress fabric you carry is. I'll take 10 yards of that as well." Jerome blinked. "10 yards, ma'am, that's a considerable—" "I know what it is," Clara said pleasantly. He began measuring. Eleanor had followed her to the counter, not quite sure what she'd walked into, but aware that the conversation had shifted terrain and that she was on less comfortable ground now. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "I don't think you have the full picture of—" "I grew up on a ranch," Clara said. She wasn't looking at Eleanor. She was watching Jerome measure the fabric, making sure the cuts were straight. "My father started with 40 acres and a mule, and a willingness to work until his hands bled. By the time he died, he had 2,000 acres and a trading company. He wore the same pair of boots for 6 years because he was spending every dollar on feed and wages." She glanced at Eleanor briefly. "He was the finest man I've ever known, and he would not have lasted one afternoon in a room with people who measured worth by what a child was wearing." The store was very quiet. Not just Jerome. Not just Eleanor. The other customers who had drifted near, and there were 3 or 4, Clara had been aware of them the whole time, were all still, listening. Eleanor said with ice under the pleasantness, I don't think this is really your concern, Miss Whitmore. You're new here. You don't know the... I know what I saw on that road yesterday, Clara said clearly. I passed Thomas Carter driving home. His daughter was asleep on his arm. She paused. A man who can raise a child like that while keeping 40 acres alive on his own, that is not a man anyone should be looking down at. Not in this town or any other. The quiet held. And then Jerome Whitaker, who had been sweeping his store at dusk the night before, and not liking the man he met in the thinking, set down his measuring tape and said, "I'll wrap that up for you, Miss Whitmore." He said it simply, quietly. But he said it. Eleanor Hartwell looked between Clara and Jerome and made a decision the way wealthy women of her particular type always made decisions to treat an uncomfortable situation as if it hadn't quite occurred. "Well," she said brightly, "I'm sure you'll find the valley very welcoming. I hope we see you at church Sunday." And she turned and went back to the dry goods section and began examining bolts of cloth she had no intention of buying. Clara paid for her fabric. Jerome wrapped it carefully and tied it with string and handed it across the counter, and did not, as he easily could have, pretend that nothing unusual had just happened. "He's a good man," Jerome said quietly. Just that. Just those 4 words. "I expect he is," Clara said. She took her package and walked to the door and stepped out onto the boardwalk into the cold October air. She stood there for a moment with the fabric under her arm and looked at the main street of Redwood Valley. The post office, the bank, the 3 churches, the hotel, the road that led north past the Ballard property, and further on to Thomas Carter's 40 acres. She made a decision. She had already been making it, she knew, since the moment on the road yesterday. But she had wanted to see the store first, wanted to stand in the place where it had happened and feel the shape of the thing, the way the room held what had occurred in it, the way it told you. If you were paying attention, everything you needed to know about a town. She'd learned what she needed. She went to find Thomas Carter. She found him at the north fence line, not 6 miles from the Ballard property, as the crow flew, replacing a post, with the particular focused efficiency of a man who has been doing physical labor all his life and has learned to waste nothing, not movement, not time, not effort. He heard the wagon coming and looked up. She could see him clock the wagon, recognize that it wasn't anyone from town, and keep working until she was close enough that stopping made more sense than continuing. He set down his post driver and straightened and looked at her with the direct, open gaze she'd noticed on the road. No performance, no deflection, just looking. "Ma'am," he said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Mr. Carter," Clara said. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for assistance, which she could see registered with him. Not a complaint, just a note. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I'm looking at the Ballard property to the south." "I know the Ballard place," Thomas said. "Good land. Been empty a while." 2 years. She looked at him steadily. "I'd like to talk to you if you have a few minutes." He glanced at the fence post, back at her. "I've got a few minutes." She didn't ease into it. She never eased into things. "I'm expanding my cattle trading operation into Wyoming," she said. "I've got 2 properties already running in Montana and 1 in Nebraska. Wyoming has better grass and a better position for winter feeding grounds. The Ballard property is what I need for the operation, but what I don't have is someone who knows this particular valley. The specific terrain. The specific weather patterns, grazing patterns, water sources." She paused. "Someone who has been working this land for years." Thomas said nothing for a moment. His face was hard to read, which she appreciated. A man whose face told you everything before he decided to tell you anything was a man whose judgment you couldn't rely on. "You're asking me if I want a job," he said. "I'm asking you if you want a partnership," Clara said. "There's a difference. I need someone to manage the Ballard operation from the ground up. Hiring workers, overseeing cattle management, maintaining the property. Someone with stake in the outcome, not just a wage." She looked at him. "I pay well, and I pay what I say I'm going to pay, which I understand is not universal in this industry." Thomas looked at the fence post lying on the ground. He looked at his ranch, the house, the barn, the 40 acres that had been the whole geography of his life since before Lily was born. He looked at Clara. "Why me?" he said. "You just got to this valley. You don't know me." "I know what you did yesterday," she said. Something moved in his face, then quick controlled gone. "Heard about that, did you?" "I was in the store this morning," Clara said. "And I saw you on the road yesterday afternoon. Your daughter was asleep on your arm." She held his gaze. "I've been running a company since I was 26 years old, Mr. Carter. My father left it to me over the objections of every man in his employ, because he said, I was the only one who understood that a business is only as good as the people who run it from the inside. I have hired a lot of people over the years. I have been wrong sometimes, and I have paid for it. And I have learned that the single most reliable indicator of a person's quality is what they do when something costs them something." She paused. "Yesterday cost you something. I watched how you handled it." Thomas was quiet. The wind moved through the grass. Somewhere in the distance a hawk called. "I've got a daughter," he said finally. 8 years old. She goes where I go." "I assumed as much," Clara said. "The ranch, my 40 acres that stays mine. I won't sell it." "I'm not asking you to sell it. And if I manage the Ballard property, I need the authority to manage it. I won't take a job where someone second-guesses every decision I make." "I'll second-guess decisions that are wrong," Clara said. "If they're right, I won't. That's how I run every property I own." He looked at her for a long time, not measuring, not calculating. Something quieter than that, the look of a man who was trying to determine if the thing in front of him was real or if he was building it out of wishful thinking because he needed it to be real. "You're serious about this," he said. "I don't make visits I'm not serious about," Clara said. "I've got a land agent drawing up papers on the Ballard property as we speak. I'd like someone I trust managing it by the time the ink is dry." Thomas picked up the post driver. He looked at the fence post on the ground. He set the post driver down again. "Let me think on it," he said. "Till tomorrow morning." "That's fair," Clara said. She climbed back up to the wagon bench. She gathered the reins, and then she paused. "Mr. Carter." He looked up. "Your daughter asked a very good question yesterday," she said. "I heard about it. Why do some people think money makes them better?" She met his eyes. "The honest answer is that they think it because we let them. Because we go quiet when we should speak. Because we lower our eyes instead of raising them." She paused. She didn't lower her eyes. Thomas said nothing. But something in his posture shifted, something she couldn't name exactly. Just a change in the quality of how he was holding himself. "Tomorrow morning," she said, and drove away. Thomas watched the wagon until it was gone. Then he picked up the post driver and went back to work. His hands were steady. His jaw was set. But inside something was moving, something that had been very still for a very long time. He worked until dark. When he came inside, Lily was at the kitchen table doing figures on a piece of brown paper she'd found somewhere. She was always finding paper to write on scraps and margins and the backs of old receipts. She looked up when he came in. "Papa, there's soup." "Thank you, sweetheart." He hung his hat and coat and sat down across from her. He watched her work for a moment, the way her tongue pressed slightly against her lip when she was concentrating, the way she held her pencil exactly the way her mother had. "Lily," he said. She looked up. "What would you think if things changed a little, if I was working a bigger operation? Different ranch close by. More responsibility." She considered this with her full attention, the way she did with everything that mattered. "Would we still live here?" "Yes." "Would Rosie still be ours?" "Rosie is always going to be ours." "Then I think," Lily said carefully, "that you should do the thing that makes you feel like yourself, not the thing that just keeps us from falling." She looked back at her figures. "Mama always said there was a difference." Thomas sat with that for a long time. He sat with it through dinner and through the dishes and through the quiet hour after Lily was in bed, when he usually sat on the porch and listened to the ranch settle. He sat with it until he knew the answer. He was at Clara's boarding house at 7 the next morning. Agnes Pruitt told him Miss Whitmore was already at breakfast, and he found her at the same corner table where she'd had coffee the morning before, with a cup and a stack of papers and the expression of someone who had already been working for 2 hours. She looked up when he came in. "Mr. Carter," she said. "I'll do it," Thomas said. Clara nodded, set down her pen. "Sit down, let's talk terms." What happened over the next hour at that corner table would set the course of the next 18 months of both their lives. They were neither of them people who said more than they meant or agreed to things they didn't intend to honor, which made the negotiation clean and quick. Thomas told her what he needed. Clara told him what she required. They found the places where those two things fit together with the efficiency of two people who were done wasting time. At the end, Clara slid a piece of paper across the table, the terms written in her clear, direct hand. Thomas read it carefully, read it again. He looked up. "This is a fair offer," he said, like he was mildly surprised and wasn't going to pretend he wasn't. "It's the offer I'd want if I were you," Clara said. "That's the only way I know how to write one." Thomas took the pen she offered and signed. He walked home that morning along the road that ran between his 40 acres and the empty Ballard property to the south, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself feel something that wasn't vigilance or calculation or the constant low hum of worry that had been his background frequency since the year Martha died. He let himself feel something that felt a little like hope. Lily was sitting on the fence by the paddock when he got back talking to Rosie, in the earnest, ongoing way she always talked to the mare, like she was carrying both sides of a conversation and was satisfied with how it was going. She saw him coming and read his face immediately, that uncanny gift of hers, the one that came straight from her mother. "You said yes," she said. "I said yes." Lily smiled, not the careful, managed smile she used in town when she was protecting herself. The real one, wide and sudden and completely unguarded, the one she almost never let strangers see. "Good," she said. "Rosie thinks so too." Thomas laughed and reached over and scratched Rosie behind the ears, and the horse pressed her head into his palm with the magnificent condescension of a mare who had been right about things before. For the next 3 weeks, Thomas threw himself into the Ballard property with everything he had. The land had been sitting empty for 2 years, and it showed. Fences down in 4 places along the south boundary. The water trough near the eastern pasture broken at the base and leaking. The main barn needed new crossbeams on the west side. The bunkhouse where workers would need to sleep had a roof that let in wind and a floorboard situation that was either bad or worse, depending on which corner you were standing in. Thomas worked from before dawn until after dark, and he worked methodically, not in the way of someone in a hurry, but in the way of someone who understood that the order of repairs mattered as much as the repairs themselves. You fixed the water supply first because everything else needed water. You fixed the fencing next because loose fencing cost you cattle. You fixed the structural problems in the barn before the cosmetic ones because a barn that fell down on animals was worse than a barn that looked rough. Clara came out 3 times that first week. She didn't stand over him. She walked the property with him, asked questions, listened to the answers, and left him to his work. But she paid attention to everything he could see that. She was building her own picture of the land, mapping it against whatever internal model she carried of what a productive operation looked like. On her 3rd visit, she brought Lily with her. Thomas hadn't asked for that. It had not occurred to him to ask for it. But Lily had been at the Ballard property once years before, when Thomas had helped the Ballard family repair a fence line, and she'd remembered it apparently because when Clara mentioned where she was going, Lily had said she'd like to come, and Clara had looked at Thomas like it was simple, and it was. Lily walked the property beside Clara, with her hands in the pockets of her coat, and that focused, serious expression she wore when she was deciding what she thought about something. "There used to be a creek here," Lily told Clara, pointing to a dry gully near the eastern pasture. "Papa said it dried up 2 summers ago. He said if you redirected the water from the north slope, you could probably get it running again." Clara looked at Thomas. Thomas said, "It's on my list." "Move it up," Clara said. He moved it up. That afternoon, walking back toward the wagon, Clara fell into step beside Lily, and they talked, not in the stilted way that adults sometimes talk to children performing interest. They didn't actually feel, but in the straightforward way of 2 people who were curious about each other. "What do you want to be?" Clara asked. "When you're grown." Lily thought about it seriously. "Something that matters," she said finally. "I don't know the name of it yet." Clara looked at her sideways. That's the best answer I've ever heard. Lily glanced up at her. What did you want to be before you ran the company? Free, Clara said. After a pause. Free to make something that was mine. Not my father's. Not my husband's. I never had one, which is a decision I made deliberately. She looked at Lily. Free to be wrong sometimes without the whole world deciding that meant I was done. Lily nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she'd been thinking about. My papa says the people who laughed at my dress are people who are afraid, she said. He says people who are sure of themselves don't need to make other people small. Your papa is right, Clara said. My mama used to say that cruelty was just pain with nowhere to go. Clara was quiet for a moment. Your mama sounds like she was remarkable. She was, Lily said simply. I don't remember her very well, but I remember the feeling of her. Does that make sense? Yes, Clara said. That makes perfect sense. Lily looked up at her with those clear, direct eyes. Are you going to stay in Redwood Valley? I think I am, Clara said. Good, Lily said. And then she went ahead to catch up with Thomas, and Clara walked behind them for a moment, watching the two of them, the rancher and his daughter, the worn coat and the patched hem and the dark braid bouncing with each step, and felt something settle in her that she hadn't been expecting. She had come to Redwood Valley for grass and grazing rights, and a good position for a winter operation. What she was finding was considerably more complicated than that, and considerably more worth finding. The first real trouble came 11 days later, and it came in the form of William Harrington. Harrington was a big man in every sense. Physically large, financially powerful, politically connected, and accustomed to being the largest voice in any room he walked into. His family had been in the valley for 30 years, which was long enough that he'd stopped distinguishing between what the valley needed and what he wanted. In his mind, those two things had merged into the same thing long ago. When word got out that Clara Whitmore had purchased the Ballard property and hired Thomas Carter to manage it, Harrington's reaction was immediate and telling. He did not go to Clara. He went to Thomas. He found him at the Ballard fence line on a cold Tuesday morning driving posts. He came alone, which Thomas noted. A man who came alone was either very confident or very deliberate. With Harrington, it was probably both. Carter, Harrington said. Thomas drove another post, looked up. Harrington. Harrington dismounted and walked to where Thomas was working. He was the kind of man who moved through space like he expected it to make room for him. Heard you signed on with the Whitmore woman. That's right. Harrington nodded slowly. Interesting choice. I thought so, Thomas said. He went back to work. She's not going to last, Harrington said. Woman comes in from out of state, thinks she can run a cattle operation in Wyoming because she did it somewhere else. It doesn't work like that. This valley has its own way of doing things. Thomas drove a post. What way is that? People who've been here, who've earned their place, who understand the relationships those people run things. Newcomers who try to come in and change the order, they don't tend to do well. Thomas straightened. He looked at Harrington directly. Is that a warning? Harrington smiled. The kind of smile that said it was absolutely a warning, and that the person smiling had never had to say so plainly in his life, because everyone always understood without being told. Just an observation, he said pleasantly. I'd hate to see you end up on the wrong side of something that's got nothing to do with you. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. I'll tell you what I think, Thomas said. His voice was completely even. I think you came out here because a woman buying the Ballard property makes you nervous, and a woman who's hired her own people makes you more nervous, because it means she's serious and she doesn't need you. And I think you're hoping I'm the kind of man who'll be frightened off by someone like you before I've done anything worth being frightened off from. He picked up the post driver. I'm not that kind of man, Harrington. The smile had gone. Harrington looked at him with the particular expression of a man who had expected to find a smaller person and had found something different. You're making a mistake, Carter, he said. I'll take that chance, Thomas said, and went back to his fence. Harrington rode away without another word. Thomas drove 3 more posts before he let himself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Because Harrington didn't make idle observations. And Redwood Valley was Harrington's terrain in ways that had nothing to do with land deeds. He sat on the county board. He had relationships with the bank. He knew the right people in Cheyenne in ways that a man like Thomas had no access to whatsoever. Thomas had just told the most powerful man in the valley to go to hell. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. He finished the fence line as the sun went down and rode back to tell Clara what had happened. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good." Thomas looked at her. "Good. If he's bothered enough to come out here himself, we're doing something right." She looked at him steadily. "Did he threaten you directly?" "Not in so many words. Then we go about our business." She picked up her pen. "And we be very, very good at it, because the best answer to William Harrington is a successful operation, not an argument, not a complaint." She met his eyes. "Work." Thomas looked at this woman sitting at a table covered in papers in a boarding house in a town that had not yet decided whether it was going to welcome her, completely unbothered by the fact that the most powerful man in the valley had just declared himself an obstacle, and he thought of something his father had once told him about the difference between brave people and fearless ones. Fearless people, his father said, didn't feel the fear. Brave people felt it completely and went forward anyway. He thought, looking at a brave person. "All right," he said. "We work." Outside, the October wind moved through the valley, cold and clean and indifferent to the plans of men like William Harrington, and the stars came out one by one over the Wyoming mountains, and in a small ranch house 6 miles north, a little girl in a dress her father had made was asleep with a pencil still loosely in her hand, dreaming whatever it was that children dreamed when they were just beginning to understand that the world was harder than it should be, and better than it sometimes seemed, and worth every bit of the fight. The trouble with William Harrington was that he was patient. Thomas had expected something immediate: a complaint filed somewhere, a worker approached and turned, a supply order delayed or refused. That was how men like Harrington usually moved: quick and visible, because they were accustomed to being visible and having it matter. But the days after that fence line conversation passed quietly, and then a week passed, and then another, and nothing came. That silence was worse than anything loud would have been. Thomas knew it. He could feel it the way you felt weather coming, not seeing it yet, but knowing it was out there building, waiting for the right moment to arrive. He said as much to Clara one evening when she came by the Ballard property to review what had been done on the water redirection project. The old dry gully Lily had pointed to, which Thomas had spent 4 days opening back up, following the natural slope of the North Ridge until water ran where it hadn't run in 2 years. "He's quiet," Thomas said. "That bothers me more than noise would." Clara looked at the water moving through the gully, slow yet, but moving, which was what mattered. "Harrington has been the biggest operation in this valley for 20 years, she said. "Men like that don't react immediately. They watch. They wait for you to make a mistake. And if you don't make one, they manufacture one." Thomas looked at her. "Manufacture how?" "Paperwork," Clara said. "Grazing boundaries, water rights. Something that looks like a legal dispute but is really just obstruction." She met his eyes. "Which is why every fence line, every water source, every boundary marker on this property needs to be documented. Exactly where it is, exactly when it was set. I want records that are bulletproof." Thomas nodded slowly. "You've dealt with men like him before." "Men like him are the reason I know how to use a lawyer," Clara said. "My father taught me that a handshake was the beginning of a deal, not the end of one. Everything else goes on paper." She paused. "How are the workers?" They had hired 6 men over the past 2 weeks, a mix of younger cowboys looking for steady wages and 2 older ranch hands who had been between situations since the Callaway spread had downsized in the spring. Thomas had been careful about who he chose. He'd looked for the same thing. He always looked for men who showed up on time, didn't complain about the work, and treated the animals like they were worth treating well. It was a simple filter, but in his experience, it caught most of what you needed to catch. "Good men," he said, "especially Eli." He nodded toward the barn, where one of the older hands, Eli Granger, was finishing up the last of the crossbeam repairs. Eli was 60-something, with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who had learned that hurry broke more than it fixed, and hands that could do more careful work in an hour than most men accomplished in a day. He had come to Thomas with a recommendation from a rancher in the next county, and had said exactly 4 words in his interview. Yes, no, fair enough, and Thomas had hired him on the spot. And the others respect him, Clara asked. They do. Age'll do that sometimes when it comes with something worth respecting. Clara nodded. Good. She looked at the water again. We need to be operational before the first hard freeze. What's the honest timeline? Thomas thought about it without rushing the answer, which was something Clara had noticed about him from the beginning. He didn't answer faster than he could think. 3 weeks if nothing breaks, 4 if something does. Plan for 4, she said, and tell me when something breaks. She left as the light was going gold over the ridge, and Thomas watched her wagon take the south road and thought not for the first time that he had never in his life met a woman who moved through the world exactly the way Clara Whitmore did, not like she was fighting for room in it, but like she had simply decided what space she was going to occupy, and had gone ahead and occupied it, and was mildly but not rudely surprised when anyone suggested otherwise. He had also noticed, though he had not yet found words for it, that he trusted that the feeling he got when her wagon was coming up the road was different from any feeling the road had given him in a long time. He didn't examine that too carefully. He had fences to think about. The first move Harrington made came on a Thursday morning 9 days after the fence line conversation. It came not through Harrington himself, but through a man named Gerald Fitch, who served on the Redwood Valley County Water Board, and who was it emerged a cousin of Harrington's by marriage and a frequent guest at Harrington's dinner table. Thomas was at the Ballard property when Fitch arrived, a thin, precise man in a town suit who tied his horse at the gate and walked toward the gully with the expression of someone who had already made up his mind before arriving. Thomas Carter, Fitch said. That's me. Fitch produced a document from inside his jacket. Gerald Fitch County Water Board. I'm here to inform you that there's a formal complaint filed regarding water diversion on this property. Specifically the work done on this gully here. He gestured at the water running through the reopened channel. There's a question about whether this constitutes unauthorized alteration of a shared water source. Thomas looked at the document. He did not reach for it. Shared with who? Harrington Cattle Company, Fitch said. The downstream rights to the North Fork of that water source were registered by William Harrington in 1874. Thomas looked at the gully, looked at Fitch. That water source was dry for 2 years, he said. Dried up naturally. We didn't alter a shared source. We reopened a natural channel on property that belongs to Clara Whitmore. The complaint suggests otherwise, Fitch said. Until the board reviews the matter, I'm afraid I have to ask you to cease. No. Fitch blinked. Mr. Carter, you're not going to ask me to stop work on a legitimate water restoration based on a complaint filed by the man who wants this property to fail, Thomas said. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it that Fitch seemed to hear because he took a small involuntary step back. I'm going to ask you to hold that document, go back to town, and tell the board that the owner of this property will respond formally within the week with full documentation of the water source history and the legal basis for this work. He looked at Fitch directly. And I'd suggest the board have a careful look at who filed that complaint and what their interest in this property is. Because a review that goes in the other direction is going to be interesting for Gerald Fitch, cousin of William Harrington. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Fitch folded his document carefully and put it back in his jacket. The board meets Friday, he said. We'll expect your response. He walked back to his horse. Thomas watched him go. Then he went inside and sat down and let his hands be less steady than they'd been in front of Fitch, because nobody was watching now, and a man was entitled to feel the weight of things when nobody was watching. He sent a message to Clara within the hour. She arrived before noon. She read the document Fitch had left. He'd handed it over eventually, and she set it down on the work table with the particular calm of someone who had been expecting something roughly like this and had prepared accordingly. I have a lawyer in Cheyenne, she said. He's been reviewing this property's water rights since before I signed the purchase papers. We have documentation. She looked up. How did you handle Fitch? Thomas told her. Clara looked at him for a moment. You threatened to expose the conflict of interest. I mentioned it might be interesting. Same thing. She almost smiled. Good. It might make things harder with the board, Thomas said. It might, Clara agreed. Or it might make Fitch nervous enough to be less useful to Harrington, which changes Harrington's calculus. She folded the document and tucked it inside her jacket, where it disappeared. The way she sometimes made problems disappear, not by making them smaller, but by making herself bigger than them. Either way, we respond with documentation, and we let the law do what it's supposed to do. Thomas nodded. He looked at her. You were expecting this. I was expecting something, she said. This is actually better than I feared. A water rights complaint is public record. Everything Harrington files has to go through official channels. That means we can see every move he makes. She met Thomas's eyes. Men who operate in the open are easier to handle than men who work in the dark. Thomas thought about that. What do you think he does in the dark? Clara picked up her jacket. That, she said, is what worries me. She was right to worry, because while the water rights complaint was moving through official channels, exactly as she'd predicted, something else was happening that had nothing to do with paperwork. One of the 6 workers. Thomas had hired a young man named Pete Dillard, who'd been solid enough in his first week, but had been quiet in a different way. The second came to Thomas on a Wednesday evening and stood at the door of the workshed with his hat in his hands and the expression of someone who had been rehearsing something and was not sure the rehearsal had been enough. Got something to tell you, Pete said. Might make you angry. Thomas set down his tools. Say it straight. Pete said it straight. He'd been approached by one of Harrington's men, not Harrington himself, which was the point always through other people, and offered double his current wage to leave the Ballard operation and take a position at Harrington's spread. The offer had also included a secondary suggestion that before he left, it might be worth his while to let certain fence lines be about a foot further south than the survey had indicated, and to be unclear about it if anyone asked. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. You're telling me this, Thomas said. Yes, sir. Instead of taking the offer. Yes, sir. Why? Pete looked at his hat, looked up. Because my father worked for a man who told him the truth for 30 years, and I know what that's worth, he said. And because Harrington's man told me what he was asking me to do, like it was nothing like moving a fence line on someone else's property, was just business. And if that's what Harrington thinks business is, I don't want his double wages. He paused. And because you gave me a fair wage and straight work, and didn't treat me like I was temporary. Thomas looked at this young man with his hat in his hands and felt something move in his chest, something that wasn't just gratitude. It was recognition, the kind you felt when you saw your own code in someone else. Thank you, Pete, he said. That took something. Didn't feel like much, Pete said honestly. But I reckon that's when it matters most. Thomas went to Clara that evening. She listened to the whole account without expression. When he finished, she sat very still for a moment. He tried to move our boundary lines, she said, through a worker who told us about it instead. Who will testify to it if necessary? Thomas nodded. I believe he would. Clara stood up and walked to the window and stood there with her arms crossed, not looking at anything in particular. Thomas had learned that this was what she did when she was moving pieces around inside her head, not pacing, not talking, just holding still and thinking with everything she had. This changes things, she said. How? She turned around. He's not just filing paperwork, Thomas. He's trying to manufacture a land dispute. A fraudulent boundary marker would give him grounds to claim part of this property. And if he'd gotten that boundary moved before we caught it... She stopped. The implication was clear enough without finishing. So what do we do? Thomas asked. We survey, Clara said. Every inch of this property professionally documented within the week, and we file those records with the county on top of the water rights response. She looked at him steadily. And then we make sure William Harrington understands that every move he makes is going to cost him more than it costs us. How do we make him understand that? By making it true, she said, and by making sure the right people in this valley can see it. The land survey happened the following Monday. Clara had a surveyor from Cheyenne, a meticulous man named Arthur Vane, who charged considerable rates and was worth every cent out to the property with all his equipment. Thomas walked every line with him personally, watching every measurement recorded. It took 2 full days. The boundary markers were exactly where the deed said they were. The documentation went to the county clerk and to Clara's lawyer simultaneously. What happened next was the thing Thomas hadn't expected. Word got out. Not in the way Clara had planned, not through a formal statement or a deliberate communication. In the way things always actually got out in a small town, through the surveyor mentioning to the livery stableman that it was unusual to need such thorough documentation, unless someone was actively trying to falsify a boundary, and the livery stableman mentioning it to 3 people, and those 3 people mentioning it to 8. Within a week, the shape of what Harrington was doing had become common knowledge in Redwood Valley, not as fact, because nobody had said it as fact, but as the strongly implied subtext of every conversation about the Whitmore property and the county water board complaint and the surveyor's visit. The town started watching. That was when something shifted. Something Thomas felt before he could name it. It was in... Jerome Whitaker nodded at him when he came in for supplies on Friday. A different nod from the careful one he used to get something with weight in it. It was in the way 2 ranchers he knew by sight, but not by name, stopped him on the road and asked about the water redirection project with genuine curiosity, not suspicion. It was in the way Agnes Pruitt, who missed absolutely nothing, told Clara over breakfast that she'd heard 3 separate conversations in the last week that suggested people in this town were tired of William Harrington deciding what was good for everyone. "The tide is moving," Clara told Thomas when she relayed this. "Tides move slow," Thomas said. "They do," she agreed. "But once they've turned, nothing pushes them back." The real test came 3 weeks later. It came in the form of a Wyoming winter, and it did not negotiate. The storm arrived on a Tuesday, and it came with the particular violence of a Wyoming November storm that had been gathering strength for days, the kind that every experienced rancher in the valley had seen the signs of, and that only the smart or the lucky had properly prepared for. Thomas had prepared. He'd begun watching the sky and the animals 10 days earlier, when the first signals started showing up, the way the cattle huddled without cause, the particular quality of the cold that came in from the north. At night, the pressure change he could feel in the air before he could measure it in any formal way. He'd seen 3 winters like this one in his 15 years on Wyoming land, and each one had taught him something the previous one hadn't. He'd made the workers bring the cattle into the lower pastures 4 days before the storm hit. He'd reinforced the barn roof with the materials he'd ordered 2 weeks earlier. He'd ensured the water supply was protected so it wouldn't freeze solid in the first 24 hours. He'd laid in hay enough for 2 weeks. When the storm broke, and it broke hard, the kind of driving snow that came horizontal and made the world 30 feet in every direction, the Ballard operation was as ready as a ranch could be for something you couldn't negotiate with. Harrington's spread was not. That wasn't Thomas's doing. He hadn't wished it on the man. He hadn't even thought about it. He'd been too busy making sure his own cattle were safe and his own workers were sheltered, and that Lily, 6 miles north on her own with the horses and the chickens, was all right. Which she was fine. She'd sent word with Eli, who went to check on her on the first morning she'd said to tell him she was managing and not to worry, which he did anyway, because that was the nature of parenting. The storm lasted 3 days. When it broke and Thomas finally got out to assess the damage, his losses were modest. 2 cattle that had managed to separate from the herd in the first hours before the wind really hit a section of the new fence that needed repairing some minor roof damage on the bunkhouse. The word from elsewhere in the valley was worse. 3 operations had lost significant cattle. 2 had structural damage to their barns. And Harrington, who had 30 years in this valley and knew every weather pattern it could produce. Harrington had lost more than anyone, because Harrington had been focused on the Whitmore property for weeks, and his foreman later admitted privately to someone who told someone else that the storm preparations had been rushed and incomplete because attention and resources had been going elsewhere. Thomas heard this from Clara, who had ridden out to the Ballard property on the morning after the storm broke with ice in her horse's mane, and a quiet in her expression that wasn't quite triumph, but was something in its neighborhood. "He lost 40 head, she said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. I don't take pleasure in that. I know, Clara said. Neither do I. She looked at him. But other ranchers in this valley noticed what happened here versus what happened there. They noticed who was prepared and who wasn't. That's not a story we told. It's a story the storm told. Thomas thought about Harrington's man coming to Pete Dillard with his offer. About Gerald Fitch and his document and his conflict of interest. About the fence lines that were supposed to be quietly moved while everyone was looking elsewhere. I was so busy trying to take what we had, Thomas said slowly, that he forgot to take care of what he already had. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. Exactly that. That afternoon, Thomas received a visitor he had not expected. He was at the south fence, working through the repairs the storm had left when he heard a horse coming from the direction of the road. He looked up. William Harrington. Again alone. Again deliberate. But something was different this time. Something in the way he sat the horse, a quality of heaviness that hadn't been there on the fence line 2 months ago. Thomas kept working. Harrington dismounted, walked over, stood 3 feet away, and looked at the pasture where Thomas's cattle were moving freely through what was left of the snow. You were ready, Harrington said. Not an accusation, something else. I've seen these storms before, Thomas said. So have I, Harrington said. 30 years of them. A pause. I was distracted. Thomas drove a nail, said nothing. I want to know something, Harrington said. His voice had lost the particular quality it carried when he was performing his own authority. He just sounded like a man who had lost 40 cattle and hadn't slept. The water rights complaint, the boundary survey. How did you know I was coming at you that way? Thomas looked up from the fence, looked at Harrington directly. Because it's what I would expect from a man who thinks the best way to stop someone is to make them prove they're standing where they said they are. Harrington was quiet for a moment. I was going to push you out, he said. It was almost matter-of-fact. I know, Thomas said. I knew it from the first time you rode out here. You weren't scared. I was scared, Thomas said. I've got 40 acres and a daughter, and I signed on with a woman who most of this town was waiting to see fail. I was scared. He met Harrington's eyes. That's different from being stopped. Something moved in Harrington's face. It was complicated, too complicated for Thomas to read all of it. But the man who had been the largest voice in every room in Redwood Valley for 30 years was standing at a fence on someone else's property in the aftermath of a storm that had cost him real things, and he was not performing anything. My foreman, Harrington said, told me last night that he should have pushed back when I told him to prioritize other things over the storm prep. He looked at the snow-covered pasture. He was right. I didn't want to hear it. Thomas said nothing. That's a hard thing to admit, Harrington said. Yes, Thomas agreed. It is. Another silence. I'm going to withdraw the water rights complaint, Harrington said. The board meeting is Friday. I'll send word before then. Thomas set down his hammer. He looked at Harrington carefully, looking for the angle, the calculation underneath the way a man looked when he was making a strategic retreat rather than a genuine one. He didn't see it. What he saw instead was a man who was tired of being the person he'd been being. Why? Thomas asked. Harrington looked at him. Because it was wrong, he said. Simple as that. And because I think I've spent a long time confusing what was good for William Harrington with what was good for this valley, and this storm reminded me that the valley doesn't actually know the difference between us. Thomas picked up his hammer again. He thought for a long moment. I appreciate that, he said finally. I won't pretend it didn't cost us something the time we spent defending against it. It did, Harrington said. That's on me. He paused. I don't expect you to trust me. That takes time, Thomas agreed. Yes. Harrington mounted his horse. He looked down at Thomas. You ready for the rest of the winter? Getting there. Harrington nodded once, a different nod from the ones he'd given before. This one had no performance in it. Carter, he said. Thomas looked up. She was right about you, Harrington said. Miss Whitmore. He turned his horse. She said you were the best man in this valley. Said it to the Calloway brothers last week when they were asking about the operation. He shook his head slightly. I should have asked around before I tried to move your fence lines. He rode away. Thomas stood at the fence for a long time after the sound of hooves had faded. The cold was real, and the work was real, and the sky overhead was that pale stripped blue of a Wyoming winter that had said everything it had to say and was waiting quietly for the next thing. I thought about what Harrington had said. Not the withdrawal of the complaint, though that mattered. Not even the admission of fault, though, that mattered more. He thought about what Clara had said. That he was the best man in this valley. He stood very still with that for a moment. Then he picked up his tools and went back to work, because there was still fence to repair, and the afternoon was short, and the cattle needed checking before dark, and a man could only hold a good feeling for so long before the practical world required him again. But he held it. He held it all the way through the afternoon and into the evening, when the light went gold and then gone, and he was riding north toward home, with the cold in his face, and the stars beginning overhead, and Lily's lamp lit in the window of the ranch house, small and steady and warm against the dark. Clara heard about the conversation at the fence line the same evening when Thomas stopped by the boarding house on his way home to tell her about it. She listened to the whole account with the same focused stillness she always brought to things that mattered. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He'll withdraw the complaint," Thomas said. "He said Friday before the board meeting." "I believe him," Clara said. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "Not because I trust him yet, but because a man who admits he was wrong in person standing at your fence without witnesses is generally telling the truth." "That's what I thought," Thomas said. She looked at him. "How do you feel about it?" It was a question that surprised him slightly, not because it was unusual, but because not many people asked it. Most people wanted to know what you'd decided or what you were going to do, not how you felt about it. "Relieved," he said honestly. "And something else I don't have a word for exactly, like watching a storm pass." He paused. "You don't celebrate a storm passing. You're just glad the damage isn't worse than it is." Clara nodded slowly. "That's the right way to feel about it." "Is it?" "Bitterness would be wrong," she said. "Triumph would be wrong. But relief is just accurate." Thomas looked at her across the table of the boarding house where they'd sat across from each other in one way or another for the past 2 months, working through problems and figures and decisions, and occasionally something that wasn't exactly either, and he thought that there were very few people in his life with whom he could sit in a room and say a thing and have it received exactly as he meant it. Clara Whitmore was one of them. He didn't say that. He said, "The county board meets Friday." "I know," she said. "My lawyer will be there." Harrington said he'd send word. "We go anyway," Clara said. "Not because I don't believe him, because we don't rely on other people's integrity as our only protection." She met his eyes. "We trust and we verify. That's not the same as suspicion." Thomas thought about that on the ride home. He thought about what it meant to extend trust that was real without making yourself dependent on it. How that was different from cynicism and different from naivety, and required something in between that most people either couldn't sustain or never found in the first place. He thought Clara had found it. He thought she'd probably had to fight hard to keep it. Lily was still up when he came in. She was always up later than he meant for her to be working on her figures or her letters, or whatever she was currently teaching herself, because she had a mind that didn't like stopping until it was done with what it was doing. She looked at him from the table and read his face the way she always did. "Something happened," she said. "Something resolved itself," he said. "More or less." "That's good." "That's good," Thomas said. He sat down across from her. "Lily, tell me something." She set down her pencil. What do you think of Clara?" Lily considered this with the full serious attention she gave to questions that deserved it. She didn't rush. She looked at the table and then the window and then back at Thomas. "I think," she said slowly, "that she's the first person besides you who talks to me like what I think matters." She paused. "And I think she's lonely. Not sad lonely. Just like she's been carrying things alone for so long that she forgot you could put some of them down." Thomas looked at his daughter. 8 years old. 8 years old, and she could see things most adults spent a lifetime not seeing. "Where did you get that?" he said quietly. Lily picked up her pencil. She looked at our ranch when she came out last week, she said. She looked at it the way people look at things they want, but don't think they're allowed to want. She started writing again. I noticed. Thomas sat with that for a long time after Lily went to bed. He sat with it on the porch in the cold, looking at the ranch he'd built, and nearly lost, and kept, because stopping had never been something he knew how to do. I thought about what Lily had said. He thought about a woman in a boarding house corner with papers on the table and coffee going cold, carrying the weight of a company, and a decision, and a valley that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted her. Carrying it alone. Having always carried things alone, probably. Having made a virtue of it probably the way you did, when you had no other choice for long enough that the carrying became part of who you were. I thought about what it might mean that she had come to Redwood Valley and found not just land and grass and grazing rights, but him and Lily. And the particular quality of a morning when the frost was on the grass and a small girl was talking to a horse and a man was watching. Both of them think it was possible that the world could still surprise you. He didn't examine it too carefully. He had fence to think about. He had cattle to think about. I had a daughter to raise and a ranch to keep, and a new operation to build, and a winter that wasn't done with Wyoming yet. But he sat on the porch a little longer than usual that night, and when he finally went inside, he was smiling. Just barely. Just enough. The county board met on Friday. William Harrington sent word, Thursday evening, as he'd said he would. Clara's lawyer attended anyway, because that was who Clara was. The water rights complaint was withdrawn without discussion. Gerald Fitch did not look at anyone in particular when it happened. And Thomas Carter, standing at the back of the county hall with his hat in his hands and his boots still dusty from the morning's work, felt the particular satisfaction of something that had been wrong. Being set right. Not dramatically, not publicly, not with any kind of fanfare, but quietly and completely, and in the proper order. The way most real things were, when they finally resolved. He walked out into the cold afternoon and mounted his horse and started the ride back to the Ballard property, where 6 men were waiting for direction, and the cattle needed checking, and the day was far from done. Behind him inside the county hall, he heard 2 ranchers he recognized exchanging words about the Whitmore operation, about the storm preparations, about the water redirection that was running clean and clear through what had been a dry gully 2 months before. He didn't stop to listen. He already knew what they were saying, because the valley was talking now. And what it was saying was no longer about the newcomer who might fail and the poor cowboy who was helping her. It was something different now. It was something that sounded, if you listened carefully enough, like respect. The respect didn't arrive all at once. It came the way most real things came in a place like Redwood Valley, gradually sideways through small acts that didn't announce themselves. A nod on the road that lasted a beat longer than it used to. A question asked at the feed store with genuine curiosity rather than skeptical appraisal. An invitation from the Calloway brothers to consult on their own water situation, extended through a third party. First carefully, like a hand offered across a gap that both sides weren't yet sure was fully bridged. Thomas accepted the invitation and went out to the Calloway property on a Thursday morning and spent 2 hours walking their north pasture, with both brothers pointing out what he saw, asking questions more than he answered them, because he'd learned that men who'd been on their land for years usually already knew what the problem was and needed someone to listen them toward the solution more than they needed someone to arrive with one. By the end of the morning, Dan Calloway, the older one, a quiet man who chose his words like they cost him something, shook Thomas's hand and held it a moment longer than a regular handshake required. "Should have talked to you 2 years ago," Dan said, "instead of going to Harrington." Thomas looked at him. "Harrington knows this land." "He knows what's good for Harrington," Dan said. "That's different." He released Thomas's hand. "You charged me nothing for this morning." "You didn't need anything I'd charge for," Thomas said. "You needed someone to look at what you'd already figured out and tell you you were right." Dan Calloway looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man recalibrating something he'd believed for a long time. "Come to supper Friday," he said. "Bring your daughter." Thomas brought Lily. It was the first social invitation they'd had in Redwood Valley that hadn't come with some ulterior quality underneath it. Some sense that they were being included so someone could get something from them, or assess them up close, or demonstrate a generosity that was really just performance. The Calloway supper was plain and warm and unpretentious, with a table full of practical people who talked about cattle and weather and the county road situation, and asked Lily questions about school, and listened to her answers with actual interest. Lily sat at that table and held herself differently than she had in Whitaker's store 2 months earlier. Not taller exactly, just more settled, like she'd found something solid under her feet and had stopped bracing for the ground to shift. Driving home that night, she was quiet for a mile. Then she said, "Papa, I like the Calloways." "They're good people," Thomas agreed. "Mrs. Calloway told me she started keeping the ranch accounts when she was 12 because her father said she was better at numbers than her brothers." Lily paused. "She said she's been keeping them for 30 years, and nobody's ever said she was wrong." Thomas glanced at her. "What did you think of that?" "I thought it was exactly the right kind of thing to be good at," Lily said. She looked out at the dark road. "Clara's good at numbers too. She was showing me how she reads the cattle trading figures last Tuesday." Thomas had known about the Tuesday visits Clara had started bringing Lily with her to the Ballard property on the days when Lily didn't have school, and they'd begun a habit of sitting together in the early afternoon while Thomas was on the land going over figures and letters and whatever else Clara had decided Lily needed to know that week. He hadn't asked for it. Clara hadn't asked permission. It had simply begun organically and completely the way things began, when two people were both paying attention. He'd watched it from a distance and felt something he couldn't name precisely. Something that sat in the chest, like warmth, or like the particular ache that came from wanting something so long that even when it arrived, you weren't sure you trusted it. "She's a good teacher?" Thomas asked. "She doesn't teach like a teacher," Lily said. "She talks to me like I'm someone who needs to know things because the things are worth knowing. Not like I need to learn them for a test or to prove I'm smart." She considered this. "It feels different." "Different how?" Lily thought for a moment. "Like she's showing me the door instead of telling me what's behind it." Thomas drove in silence for a while. The stars were very clear. The cold was the clean kind, not the mean kind. "Papa," Lily said. Do you like Clara?" The question was straightforward the way Lily's questions always were. She didn't ask things she didn't want the answer to, and she didn't ask things she didn't already suspect. Thomas was quiet for long enough that it was its own kind of answer. "I respect her a great deal," he said carefully. Lily looked at him with the expression she wore when she thought an adult was being technically accurate and completely evasive. "That's not what I asked," she said. Thomas kept his eyes on the road. "I know." Lily turned back to looking at the stars. She didn't push it because she'd gotten what she needed, which was the fact of the pause itself. After that, she didn't bring it up again for a while. December arrived, and the Ballard operation moved into its first full winter running, and Thomas threw himself into the work, the way he threw himself into every season completely, without holding anything back. There was always more to do than there were hours for doing it. The cattle needed constant attention in the cold. The workers needed management that was firm without being harsh. The records Clara required meticulous detailed, the kind she could bring to a bank or a court or a board meeting and have them speak for themselves, needed maintaining every evening when Thomas was already tired and would have preferred to be done. He maintained them anyway, because they were important, and because he had said they would be done, and because a man who didn't follow through on the things he said he'd do was not the man Thomas Carter had spent 40 years trying to be. Clara came to the Ballard property 3 times a week now, sometimes 4. She had moved out of Agnes Pruitt's boarding house and into the Ballard house itself, a practical decision about proximity to the operation, which was what she said it was, and was also clearly what it was, with no subtext that Thomas could find in it that he trusted himself to read accurately. Agnes Pruitt, for what it was worth, had told Thomas privately that she was going to miss the morning conversations. "She's a good woman," Agnes had said. "Sharper than most men in this valley, and better mannered about it, which must cost her something." Thomas had agreed. It was on a cold Tuesday in December, 3 weeks before Christmas, that everything shifted in a way nobody had planned for. Thomas was at the Ballard house going over the month's cattle figures with Clara when Eli Granger knocked on the door and came in with the particular expression of a man bearing news he hadn't decided how to carry yet. "Got a visitor at the gate," Eli said. "Eleanor Hartwell." The room went very still. Thomas looked at Clara. Clara set down her pen. "Alone?" she asked. "Alone," Eli said. "On foot, actually. Left her horse at the post. She doesn't look the way she usually looks." That was enough. Thomas stood up. Clara was already at her coat. Eleanor Hartwell was standing at the gate of the Ballard property with her hat in her hands. Not metaphorically, but actually her good hat removed and held in front of her, like she'd forgotten it was there. She looked like a woman who had been awake for a long time. She saw them coming and didn't move. She waited. Which was different from the Eleanor who walked into rooms assuming they'd rearrange themselves around her. Clara reached her first. She stopped 3 feet away and looked at Eleanor with the direct, clear gaze that never shifted into anything soft or performative. Eleanor looked at Clara, then at Thomas, then down at her hat. "I've been trying to come for 2 weeks, she said. Thomas said nothing. "I kept telling myself it wasn't necessary," Eleanor continued. Her voice had the quality of something that had been rehearsed and then abandoned in favor of just saying it. That enough time had passed, that things had moved on. She looked up. "But my daughter asked me last week why I looked sad, and I told her I wasn't sad. And she looked at me the way children look at you when they know you're lying, and I—" She stopped, pressed her lips together for a moment. "She's 9, and she looked at me like I was someone she wasn't sure of yet." The cold was real, and the silence was real, and Thomas stood in both of them and waited. I treated your daughter badly," Eleanor said. She looked at Thomas directly now. "In that store. I said things that were cruel and unnecessary and untrue in any way that matters. I said them because I was thoughtless, and because I had spent a long time in a town where nobody told me not to." Her voice was steady, but barely. "There is no version of that where I was right, not even a little." Thomas looked at this woman, the banker's wife, the woman in the green hat, the woman Lily had said was unhappy because she knew what she was and couldn't stop being it, and he felt the complicated mixture of things that came when someone arrived with real accountability instead of the performance of it. "Why now?" he asked. "Because your daughter walked past me at church Sunday," Eleanor said. "And she looked at me the way your daughter looks at everything, clear and direct and completely without bitterness." She shook her head slightly. "I don't know how she managed that, after what I said, but she looked at me like I was a person who might still be worth looking at, and I—" She stopped again. It was harder to bear than anger would have been. Thomas thought about Lily. About the drive home from town, her face composed, her chin up, her question asked in a quiet voice in the middle of the store. About the girl who had read Eleanor's cruelty as pain with nowhere to go, and had somehow, without being asked, left the door open anyway. "I'll tell you something," Thomas said slowly. "What you said that day cost my daughter something. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at her dress instead of her, but it was the worst time. And I want you to know that because I think you should know the full weight of what you're apologizing for." Eleanor held his gaze through that. She didn't flinch from it. "I know," she said. "I want to know." Thomas looked at her for a long, measuring moment. "She forgave you before you got here," he said. "That's who she is. I don't say that to make you feel better. I say it so you know what kind of person you were unkind to, and what kind of character it takes to meet cruelty the way she met yours." He paused. "I accept your apology. Not because it fixes what happened, but because I'm not interested in carrying that weight forever, and because I want my daughter to see that this is how it's done. Someone says they were wrong, you acknowledge it, and you move forward." Eleanor let out a breath. A real one. The kind that came from somewhere deep. "Thank you," she said. "I know I don't deserve—" "No," Thomas said, not unkindly. "Don't tell me what you deserve. Just be different going forward. That's all any apology is really worth." Clara had been quiet through all of it. When Eleanor looked at her, perhaps expecting something harder, Clara said simply, "Come in, it's cold." Eleanor blinked. "Come in," Clara said again. "Have coffee. I have figures to finish, and Thomas has cattle to check, but you can sit for a few minutes if you want to." It was such a practical, unadorned offer that Eleanor almost smiled at the unexpectedness of it. She came in. She sat at the kitchen table with her hat in her lap, while Clara poured coffee, and Thomas went back to the figures, and they were 3 adults in a warm room that 2 months ago would have been an impossible configuration, and now was just what it was. After about 20 minutes, Eleanor said, "My husband could be useful to you." Clara looked up. "Not as a favor," Eleanor said. "I'm not offering a favor. I mean practically. James handles the commercial accounts for most of the operations in this valley. If you're planning to expand, and I suspect you are having a bank relationship that isn't adversarial, would be worth something to you." Clara looked at her steadily. "Why would your husband want a relationship with my operation?" "Because you survived Harrington's interference and a Wyoming blizzard, and came out with more cattle than anyone else in the valley," Eleanor said. "James is a practical man. He understands what that means." A pause. "I think I was not always married to a man I entirely agreed with, and I think I did some of his work for him in that store, and I think he doesn't entirely know that, and I think it's time for some things to be different." Clara set down her pen. She looked at Eleanor Hartwell, the way she looked at all things that arrived in unexpected forms, carefully without prejudice, giving it the genuine consideration it might or might not deserve. "Tell your husband to come out Friday," Clara said. "Thomas will be here. We'll talk." James Hartwell came on Friday. How was a smaller, quieter man than Thomas had expected, the kind of man who let his wife occupy the room and occupied the edge of it himself, which explained some things about Eleanor, and some things about the marriage, and some things about the way powerful positions sometimes attracted the wrong people to fill them. He sat across from Clara and Thomas, and he was honest in the way that men were sometimes honest when they'd been given permission by their wives to stop performing and just be accurate. The Whitmore operation was sound, he said. The cattle trading records Clara had shared with him in advance of the meeting were better than anything he'd seen from operations twice the size. He could offer terms that would support expansion, real terms, not the conditional hedged terms that were really just a way of keeping small operations small. He looked at Thomas when he said this last part, not at Clara. Thomas said, "Why are you looking at me?" Hartwell said, "Because I think you're the one who needs to trust this for it to work. Miss Whitmore's numbers speak for themselves, but you're the one running the land." Thomas considered this. "That's an honest thing to say." "I'm trying to be honest today," Hartwell said. He had the expression of a man for whom this was somewhat new and not entirely comfortable. "I've been letting things go on in this town that I could have stopped, and I want to be clearer about what I stand for going forward." Thomas looked at Clara. Clara looked at the figures on the table. "We'll talk about the terms," she said. They talked about the terms for 2 hours, and at the end of it, Clara shook James Hartwell's hand across the table, and Thomas shook it after her, and the relationship between the Whitmore operation and First Valley Bank changed with that handshake in ways that would matter for the next 10 years. After the Hartwells left, Thomas stood at the window and looked at the road. "You trust him?" he asked. "Not yet," Clara said. "But I trust that he wants to be trustworthy. That's a different thing, and it's enough to work with." She paused. "Do you trust Eleanor?" Thomas thought about it honestly. "I trust that she meant what she said. I trust that her daughter scared her into becoming someone better." He paused. "Whether she manages it, I don't know." "Most people don't manage it all the way," Clara said. "But the trying matters." He turned from the window. She was back at the figures. She was always back at the figures, or the correspondence, or some other piece of the operation that required her attention, because the operation never stopped requiring her attention, and she never stopped giving it. He watched her for a moment. She looked up, caught him watching, and held his gaze for a beat. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She looked at him, the way Lily looked at him when she thought he was being technically accurate and completely evasive. He went back to the cattle figures. But something had shifted between them in that small exchange. Something that both of them noticed and neither of them addressed, because there was work to do, and the winter wasn't done, and they were both people who waited until they were sure. Christmas came to Redwood Valley, with snow that was gentle. This time, the kind that fell soft and stayed white on the rooftops, rather than driving horizontal and taking cattle. Lily made decorations for the ranch house from scraps of ribbon and dried pine cones she'd collected in October, when she'd apparently been planning this already. She also made a small wreath that she insisted on taking to the Ballard house and hanging on the door, which Clara received with a warmth that was entirely unguarded and completely genuine. Clara had in return given Lily a gift that Thomas learned about secondhand, a set of proper ledger books, the kind used in business, and a lesson in how to use them. Lily had come home from the Ballard house that afternoon and immediately begun keeping accounts of the ranch's chicken and egg production in the precise, careful figures Clara had shown her. Thomas had stood in the doorway, watching his daughter record numbers in a ledger, and felt something so full and complicated that he'd had to step outside for a minute. He stood in the cold and looked at his 40 acres. The fences were solid. The barn roof had held through the hard storm. Rosie was in the paddock making her opinions about the temperature known in small, forceful ways. Inside, a lamp was burning, and his daughter was writing carefully in a new book that a woman had given her because she'd looked at an 8-year-old girl and seen someone worth investing in. Thomas pressed his hand briefly against the barn door. Old habit, something to hold on to. He had come so close so many times to losing this. Not to anyone in particular, just to the slow accumulation of hard seasons and small margins, and the particular loneliness of raising a child alone after losing the person you'd meant to do it with. He hadn't lost it. And now there was more of it than there had been in a long time. More work, yes, and more difficulty, and more to protect. But more also of the thing that made the work worth doing. He went back inside. January brought the valley's usual cold, and the Ballard operation ran through it without crisis. The cattle were healthy. The workers were steady. Eli Granger turned out to be not just a skilled hand, but an unofficial diplomat. The workers brought their complaints to him first, and he filtered them with the judgment of someone who had seen enough of work to know which complaints were real and which were just the ordinary friction of men in close quarters during a hard winter, and he brought Thomas only the ones that required actual attention. Thomas told him this one morning plainly. Eli said, "I know what I'm worth, Mr. Carter. I just never worked for a man who did too." Thomas said, "Start calling me Thomas." Eli said, "Fair enough." It was in late January that Pete Dillard, the young man who had turned down Harrington's offer and come to Thomas instead, came to Thomas with a different kind of news. He knocked on the work shed door in the early evening, hat in hands again, the same stance as the night he'd told Thomas about Harrington's approach. Thomas looked at him and thought not for the first time that Pete Dillard had the face of someone who would always look young, but had the character of someone who had decided early what kind of man he intended to be. "Something on your mind," Thomas said. "I want to learn to manage," Pete said. "Not just work. I want to understand how you think about the operation. The whole thing, not just my part of it." He looked Thomas in the eye. "I'll work any extra hours you need. I just want to learn." Thomas looked at him for a moment. "Why?" "Because I want to run my own place someday," Pete said. "And because you're the best man I've worked for, and I want to understand how you do what you do before I'm somewhere else trying to do it without the knowledge." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He thought about the first job he'd had at 16 on a ranch outside of Laramie, and the foreman who had explained things twice without complaint and treated Thomas's questions as worth answering, and had shaped in ways Thomas had never thanked him for the kind of manager Thomas eventually became. "Come in," Thomas said. "Sit down. We'll start with the water rotation." The lesson lasted 2 hours. It was the first of many. February arrived, and Clara made an announcement that she delivered to Thomas at the Ballard house on a cold afternoon with the directness that was always how she delivered things that mattered. She was buying more land. Not in Redwood Valley. She already had what she needed here. North of here. Another property in Montana adjacent to one she already owned, which would give her a corridor from the Wyoming grazing grounds up through the northern range that no single operation in the territory currently had. She was going to need someone she trusted to manage the transition. Thomas listened to all of this, and then said, "You're telling me because it affects the Ballard operation." "I'm telling you because it affects you," Clara said. He looked at her. "I'm going to need to spend more time in Montana," she said. "That means the Ballard operation runs more independently than it has been. I need to know it can." She paused. "And I need to know that you'll still be here when I come back." The sentence had weight in it. Thomas heard the weight. "I'll be here," he said. "You're sure?" she said. Not a challenge. Something quieter. "Clara." He said her name in a way he hadn't quite said it before, direct, without the professional buffer of Mr. and Miss, without the slight distance they'd both maintained for months, because neither of them was sure the other one wanted it closed. "I'll be here, however long you're gone, and whatever you need when you get back." That's not a business answer. That's just what I'm telling you. She looked at him steadily for a long moment. "All right," she said quietly. "Then that's settled." She left for Montana in the first week of March. Lily watched the wagon go from the gate of the Ballard house with her arms folded and the expression of someone processing a feeling she wasn't entirely sure what to call. "She'll come back," Thomas said. "I know she will," Lily said. She wasn't worried. She was just missing something preemptively, the way you did when you'd learned that people you loved left sometimes, and you knew it was all right, and you still stood at the gate anyway. "Papa." "Yeah." "You should tell her," Lily said. "When she comes back, you should just tell her." Thomas looked at his daughter. "Tell her what?" he said. He said it like he didn't know which was the longest lie he'd told in years. Lily looked at him with infinite patience and something very close to affection, and shook her head slowly. "Papa," she said. "I'm 8 years old, and I know. So you definitely know." She walked back toward the house. Thomas stood at the gate and watched the road where Clara's wagon had been, and felt the cold and the quiet, and the particular ache of something you'd been moving toward for months that had not yet arrived. He turned around and went back to work. The cattle needed checking. The figures needed updating. And spring in Wyoming came when it was good and ready, and not a moment before. But it always came. Clara came back on a Thursday. Thomas didn't know exactly when she was coming. She'd sent word from Montana 2 weeks earlier saying the land acquisition was finalized, and she'd be heading south before the end of March, but Wyoming roads in early spring were unreliable things, and timelines were suggestions more than promises. He'd stopped expecting her on any particular day, and had gone back to the work, which was always there, and always sufficient to fill whatever space he gave it. Howe was at the north fence of the Ballard property when he heard the wagon. He knew it was her before he saw it. He knew the sound of those matched roans, the particular rhythm of how that wagon moved when Clara was driving it herself, rather than having her young driver handle it. He didn't put down his tools immediately. He finished the section of fence he was working on, drove the last nail clean, tested the post with both hands to make sure it held. Then he turned around. She looked the same, and completely different. Same dark eyes, same practical clothing, same way of sitting a wagon seat like she'd been born to it. But something in her face had changed in 6 weeks, some quality of lightness that hadn't been there when she left, like Montana had given her something back that she hadn't known she was missing. She pulled the wagon to a stop and looked at him across the distance. "Fence looks good," she said. "It held the whole time you were gone," he said. "Which it was supposed to." She climbed down without waiting and walked toward him across the hard ground, and he walked toward her, and they met in the middle, the way they'd been meeting in the middle of things since October. "The Montana property is going to work," she said. "Better than I thought. The corridor between the 2 ranches gives us winter flexibility we didn't have before." "Good," Thomas said. She looked at him. "How are things here?" "Good," he said again. She tilted her head slightly. "That's the second time you've said good without saying anything." "I'm getting to the rest of it," Thomas said. She waited. He looked at this woman who had walked into a store in October and defended his daughter and offered him a partnership and changed the entire shape of his life, without, as far as he could tell, ever doing any of it, for any reason, other than that it was the right thing, and she was the kind of person who did right things when she saw them clearly. He thought about what Lily had said at the gate in March. He thought about the months of almost saying and carefully not saying, and the professional distance he'd maintained with a discipline that had cost him more than he'd admitted. "Lily told me I should tell you something when you came back," he said. Clara was very still. "She said she was 8 years old, and she already knew," Thomas continued. "So I definitely knew." He paused. "She was right. I've known for a while. I just wasn't sure I wasn't sure it was what you wanted." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I bought land in Montana that is 6 hours north of here." She held his gaze. "And I came back in 3 weeks." He looked at her. "That should have told you something," she said. "It should have." He saw that clearly now. "I reckon it should have," he said. She almost smiled. Not quite. The serious thing was still in her eyes. "I've been running things alone for a long time. By choice partly. Partly because there wasn't anyone I trusted enough to run them with." She looked at him steadily. "I trust you, Thomas. Not just with the land. With the things that matter more than the land." Thomas took one step toward her, and then Lily's voice came from the direction of the house, high and clear, and completely delighted. "She's back." Both of them turned. Lily was running across the yard at full speed, braid flying completely unconcerned with any of what had been happening in the last 30 seconds, which she had probably watched from the window and timed her entrance accordingly. She hit Clara at approximately full velocity, and Clara caught her and laughed a real laugh, surprised and full, and nothing like the careful managed smile she used in professional rooms, and held Lily with both arms and said, "I missed you." And Lily said, "I kept your ledger going while you were gone. I recorded everything, even the eggs." And Clara said, "Show me." And Lily took her hand and started pulling her toward the house. She looked back at Thomas over her shoulder. Her expression said, "I knew it." "Also, you're welcome." Thomas stood at the fence and watched the two of them go. Something had settled. Something that had been in motion since October, since a store and a question, and a girl in a calico dress, and a road, and 2 wagons passing close on a narrow track, had finally arrived where it was always going. He picked up his tools and went to join them. What happened in Redwood Valley? Over the following months, moved faster than anyone, including Thomas and Clara, had planned for. The bank relationship with James Hartwell proved to be exactly what Clara had assessed it would be: practical and reliable without the warmth of friendship, but with the honesty of people who had decided to do right by each other because it served everyone better. Hartwell was not a man who changed dramatically. He was too settled in himself for that, but he was a man who had recalibrated, and recalibration was sometimes enough. Eleanor Hartwell was harder to describe. She did not become a different person overnight because real change never worked that way. But she began to be careful in the way she hadn't been before. She stopped the casual cruelties that had been such ordinary texture of her days that she'd barely noticed she was performing them. She asked after Lily by name when she saw Thomas in town, real questions with genuine interest in the answers. She never fully explained what had happened to make her come to the Ballard property that December afternoon. But Thomas had his theory, and it matched what Lily had said about people who knew what they were and couldn't stop being it. Sometimes a 9-year-old's disappointed gaze was the thing that finally broke through what decades of social success had built up, because a child's judgment had no political calculation in it, and no mercy that was really just self-protection. Eleanor had seen herself in that gaze, and she'd had enough of who she was looking at. The spring cattle market came in April, and the Whitmore operation's first major sale was every number Clara had projected, and then some. The cattle Thomas had managed through the winter were healthy and well-fed, a direct result of the storm preparations that had saved them when other operations had lost animals, and of the water redirection that kept the eastern pasture productive through February when other pastures had gone dry. The Calloway brothers were at the market. Dan Calloway found Thomas at the end of the first day and told him with the characteristic economy of a man who said things once and meant them completely that the Whitmore operation had made 3 other ranchers in the valley reconsider their water management. He said it like it was a fact worth noting. Thomas accepted it as one. William Harrington was at the market too. He and Thomas crossed paths near the livestock pens in the mid-morning. It was the first time they'd been in the same place since the fence line conversation in November, since the storm, and the withdrawn complaint, and the moment where something had shifted between two men who had been on opposing sides of something that had never really needed to be a fight. Harrington looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Harrington. "Good winter," Harrington said. "Not a question. Good winter," Thomas agreed. Harrington looked at the pens at the Whitmore cattle, healthy and solid. "Mine came through better than expected," he said. "Made some changes to the storm prep after November." "Smart," Thomas said. A pause. "Your manager," Harrington said. "The young one, Dillard." "Pete," Thomas said. "He's ready for more," Harrington said. "I've watched him work 2 operations this spring on the equipment loans. He handles men twice his age without making them feel handled." Thomas looked at Harrington. "Are you telling me to promote Pete Dillard?" Harrington's mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but was in that territory. "I'm making an observation," he said. "You can do with it what you want." Thomas did with it what he wanted. That same week, he sat Pete down and told him he was taking on full supervisory responsibility for the eastern pasture operations, the water management system, the cattle rotation, the worker assignments. Full authority, full accountability. Pete looked at him for a moment. That's a real position," he said. "That's what I said," Thomas confirmed. "I'm 23 years old," Pete said. "I know how old you are," Thomas said. "I also know what you're worth. Those 2 things aren't the same number, and a man who waits until his age catches up to his ability before doing the work is a man who wastes a lot of good years." He looked at Pete directly. "Can you do it?" Pete sat up straighter. "Yes, sir." "Thomas," Thomas said. "Yes, Thomas," Pete said. It was the right answer. Summer came to Redwood Valley, like it always did, fast and dry and certain with the particular quality of Wyoming heat that hit hard but carried none of the thick suffocation of more eastern climates. The land was good under the sun. The grass in the eastern pasture, fed by the water that had been running clean through the redirected channel for 8 months now, was better than any comparable pasture in the valley. 3 ranchers came out to look at the water system in June. Thomas showed them what he'd done, not showing off, just showing the way. He'd shown the Calloway brothers in October, because knowledge shared was one of the things that made a place a community, rather than just a collection of competing interests. Clara watched him do this from a distance once, and when the ranchers were gone, she said, "You know you're giving away an advantage." "I know," Thomas said. And a valley where everyone's operation runs well is a better place to raise a daughter than a valley where I'm the only one who knows how to manage water," he said. "And a better place to run cattle, and a better place to live." He looked at her. "You don't actually think I shouldn't have shown them?" Clara considered him. "No," she said. "I don't." She looked at him the way she sometimes looked at him now, without the professional assessment underneath it, without any distance at all. Lily was 11 by then. She'd grown 3 inches since October of the previous year, and had opinions about everything, and kept 3 separate ledgers: the eggs, the ranch supplies, and a personal accounting book that she called her observations, which was exactly what it was: a careful record of what she noticed, what it cost, and what it was worth. She had also, at some point in the preceding months, decided that Clara's presence at the ranch was permanent in a way that had nothing to do with business, and had arranged her own life accordingly, sharing meals, sharing lessons, sharing the particular shorthand that developed between people who spent enough real time together. She called Clara by her first name, which Clara had requested at some point Thomas hadn't been present for. She also, on 2 occasions that Thomas had witnessed, corrected Clara's addition in the ledgers. Clara had been correct both times that she was wrong, and had said so without embarrassment, which Lily had received with the satisfaction of a person who had been waiting to see if the rule applied universally. It was on a Sunday in late June, the kind of morning where the light came clean and early, and the whole valley looked like it had been set down fresh, that Thomas did the thing he'd been carrying since March. He found Clara on the porch of the Ballard house going over correspondence, which was where she was most Sunday mornings before the day got started. He sat down across from her and waited until she looked up. She looked up. He said, "I want to ask you something." She set down her pen. "I'm not a wealthy man," Thomas said. "I have 40 acres and a good horse and a daughter who is going to be the smartest person in any room she walks into for the rest of her life. I know what you have and what you've built, and that you didn't build it by making decisions based on sentiment." He held her gaze. "But I've been in love with you since approximately November, and I reckon I should stop conducting myself like I'm not." Clara looked at him. She looked at him for long enough that he had time to remember every version of this conversation he'd run through in his head over the past 3 months, every contingency, every possible response. Then she said, "November." "November," he confirmed. "I knew in October," she said. He stared at her. "The fence line," she said. "The morning you told Harrington you weren't the kind of man who'd be frightened off." She held his gaze completely. "I knew then." "You knew in October," Thomas repeated slowly. "And you waited until March to say I should tell you something." "You needed to get there on your own," Clara said. "I wasn't going to pull you somewhere you weren't ready to go." Thomas sat with that for a moment. "That is," he said, "the most infuriating reasonable thing anyone has ever said to me." Clara smiled. The real one, wide and unguarded, the one she almost never let anyone see. "I know." He reached across the table and took her hand. She let him. They sat there on the porch of the Ballard house in the early Sunday morning light, with their hands together and the valley quiet around them, and nothing that needed to be said immediately, because everything that needed to be said had been said, and the rest of it was just what came next. What came next was Lily. She appeared in the doorway behind Clara, with her ledger under her arm and her braid not yet done, and the expression of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment for approximately 8 months and was not going to pretend otherwise. She looked at their joined hands. She looked at Thomas. She looked at Clara. "Finally," she said, and walked back inside. Clara turned to look at the doorway where Lily had been. Then she turned back to Thomas. "Your daughter," she said, "has been more patient about this than either of us." "She gets that from her mother," Thomas said. "The patience, and the part where she knows everything before anyone tells her." Clara's hand tightened on his. They got married in September, in Redwood Valley's Methodist Church, in a ceremony that Agnes Pruitt attended and cried through with the uninhibited enthusiasm of a woman who felt personally responsible for the outcome. Jerome Whitaker was there, the store owner who had gone home the previous October and swept his floor and not liked the man he met in the thinking. He'd become over the intervening year something closer to what he should have been all along, a fair witness to the town he lived in, someone who saw clearly and said something when what he saw required it. The Calloway brothers came, both of them. Dan Calloway shook Thomas's hand for a long time after the ceremony and didn't say anything, which was his way of saying everything. Pete Dillard was there with his hat pressed flat and his expression that of a young man witnessing something he intended to remember. Eli Granger came in his good coat, which turned out to be a very fine coat indeed, and stood in the back of the church with his arms folded and the quiet satisfaction of a man watching people he respected doing something worth watching. Eleanor Hartwell sat 3 pews from the front. She did not perform her attendance. She just sat there and listened, and at one point Thomas, turning from the front of the church, caught her eye and nodded, and she nodded back, and that was enough. William Harrington sent a gift, a fine saddle well made with a note that said only, "For the best managed operation in the valley." No signature, but no one needed one. Clara stood beside Thomas in that church in a dress that was not elaborate. She had chosen it herself, characteristically for quality and practicality, rather than display. And she looked at him the way she looked at the things she'd decided fully and permanently, without reservation, and without the need for anyone else's confirmation. Thomas looked back at her and thought about all the things that had brought them both to this room, the hard seasons, the losing, the rebuilding, the particular stubbornness required to go on believing something was worth fighting for when the evidence was thin and the world was unkind. He thought about a girl in an old calico dress standing in the middle of Whitaker's general store, with her chin up and a question in her voice that the whole room heard. He thought about a wagon on a narrow road in October. He thought about fence posts and water rights and a November storm that told the truth about who had prepared and who hadn't. He thought about all of it and felt the full weight of it, not as burden, but as ballast. The thing that kept you upright. The thing that made where you were mean something because of where you'd been. Lily stood beside Clara. She was dressed carefully in the wool dress that Clara had helped her choose, not as charity, not as a gift, but as a decision they'd made together, standing in Whitaker's general store on a Saturday morning, where Jerome had greeted them warmly, and the bolts of fabric had been exactly where they always were, and nobody had laughed. Lily held a small bouquet and looked at the front of the church with the expression she wore when she was deciding what she thought about something important. Then she looked at Thomas. He saw her decide. She stood up straighter. And she smiled, the wide, unguarded one, the one she'd inherited from Martha, and had spent too long hiding in public because she'd learned too early that it made her vulnerable. She wasn't hiding it now. Thomas smiled back and thought, there it is. There is the whole of it. The years that followed were not without difficulty. No years were. The cattle business was never simple, and Wyoming weather was never predictable, and the expansion into Montana created new problems faster than old ones were solved, which was the nature of growth. But the Whitmore-Carter operation became what Clara had always designed it to be. Not the largest in the territory, but the best run. The kind of operation that other ranchers looked at when they were trying to understand why something wasn't working on their own land. The kind that good workers sought out because the wages were fair and the management was honest, and a man who showed up and did his work was treated like that meant something. Pete Dillard ran the eastern operations for 4 years before he bought a small piece of land of his own north of the valley and began building something that bore a clear resemblance in its structure and values to the place he'd learned in. He came back to Thomas the morning he signed the papers, and Thomas shook his hand and said, "You ready?" And Pete said, "I reckon I'll find out." Which was the right answer, and both of them knew it. Lily turned 16 the year Pete bought his land. By then she was keeping all 3 operations accounts, the Wyoming ranch, the Ballard property, and the Montana corridor, with a precision that Clara's Cheyenne lawyer had once during a review meeting described as remarkable for someone of any age. Lily had thanked him politely and then corrected one of his own figures. He'd accepted the correction without objection, which told you everything about the quality of the figure. Thomas watched his daughter become the person she'd been becoming since the moment she was born. Slowly, steadily, with the particular combination of her mother's clarity and her father's stubbornness, and something entirely her own that neither of them had given her, except by being who they were in front of her for long enough that she'd absorbed it. She was not without hardship. No life was. She carried things she didn't show everyone the way people who had learned early to protect themselves carried things carefully, privately processing them in the pages of her observations ledger late at night when the house was quiet. Thomas knew this, the way he knew most things about his daughter, not because she told him directly, but because he paid attention, and because she was his, and he had been paying attention since before she could talk. I didn't push her toward openness she hadn't chosen. He just made sure she knew the door was there. It was always open, and she always eventually came through it. The old blue calico dress hung on a peg in Lily's room from the time she was 12 until the time she left for her own life. She'd asked for it specifically when they moved to the Ballard house, permanently had gone back to the Carter ranch and taken it from the chest where Thomas had stored it and brought it with her like it was something that mattered. Clara had asked her once quietly why she kept it. Lily had looked at the dress for a moment. "Because it's where I started," she said. "And I don't ever want to forget that where I started didn't decide where I ended up." She paused. "But also because my father made it, with his own hands, with what he had. And that's the most valuable thing anyone ever gave me. And I knew that even when I was 8 years old standing in Whitaker's store trying not to cry." She straightened the dress on its peg. "Some people would have thrown it away. I don't understand those people." Clara looked at the dress. She looked at Lily. She didn't say anything because there was nothing to add. Thomas only heard about this conversation later from Clara, who told him in the quiet of an evening after Lily had gone to bed, told him simply without decoration, because that was how Clara told things that mattered. He sat with it for a long time. Then he said, "She's going to be all right." "She's already all right," Clara said. "She was always going to be. Thomas looked at his wife across the table at this woman who had walked into a store on an October morning and changed everything that needed changing. Not with a grand gesture, not with charity, but with the simple radical act of seeing people clearly and responding to what she saw. He thought about what kind of person it took to do that. I thought about the 40 acres that were still his, still standing still, the foundation of everything. He thought about the fence he'd been repairing when she first came back from Montana, and the nail he'd driven clean before he'd let himself turn around. He thought about a storm that told the truth about who had prepared, and a night on a porch with the stars out, and something almost like hope, and a little girl in a calico dress who had asked the right question in the middle of a room full of people who needed to hear it. I thought about all of it, and felt not nostalgia, not sentimentality, but the solid, grounded satisfaction of a man who had held on when holding on was all there was and had been standing in the right place when the tide turned. Some people were given their lives. Thomas Carter had built his. And the woman beside him, and the daughter asleep down the hall, and the valley that had finally learned to see them clearly, these were not things that had happened to him. They were things he had earned, things they had all earned, with honest work and the refusal to lower their eyes, and the understanding passed down from a man to his daughter, to the daughter's daughters, that a person's worth was never in what they wore, or what they owned, or what the room thought of them when they walked through the door. It was in what they carried inside, and what they chose again and again when it cost them something to choose it to do with what they carried. That was the whole of it. That was everything.